The Queen Elizabeth-class battleships were a class of 5 super-dreadnoughts of the Royal Navy commissioned in 1915–16. The lead ship was named after Elizabeth I of England. These battleships were superior in firepower, protection and speed to the Royal Navy predecessors of the Iron Duke class as well as preceding German classes such as the König class, although the corresponding Bayern-class ships were competitive except for being 2 knots slower. As such, the Queen Elizabeths are generally considered the first fast battleships. The Queen Elizabeths were the first battleships to be armed with 15-inch guns, and were described in the 1919 edition of Jane's Fighting Ships as the most successful type of capital ship yet designed. Quote, "They saw much service in both World Wars. HMS Byron was lost to U-boat attack in 1941, but the others survived the wars and were scrapped in the late 1940s. Design. Following the success of the 13.5-inch 45 caliber gun, the Admiralty decided to develop a 15-inch 42 gun to equip the battleships of the 1912 construction program. The move to the larger gun was accelerated by 1 or 2 years by the intervention of Winston Churchill, now at the Admiralty. Rather than waiting for prototype guns, the entire design was optimized on paper for the new weapon, and construction commenced immediately. In making this decision, the Admiralty ran a considerable risk, as a forced reversion to the 12-inch 13.5-inch gun would have resulted in a ship with weakened striking power. The initial intention was that the new battleships would have the same configuration as the preceding Iron Duke class, with 5 twin turrets and the then standard speed of 21 knots. However, it was realized that, by dispensing with the so-called Q turret amidships, it would be possible to free up weight and volume for a much enlarged power plant, and still fire a heavier broadside than the Iron Duke. The original 1912 program envisaged 3 battleships and a battlecruiser, possibly an improved version of HMS Tiger named Leopard. However, given the speed of the new ships, envisaged as 25 knots, it was decided that the battlecruiser would not be needed and a 4th battleship would be built instead. When the Federation of Malay States offered to fund a further capital ship, it was decided to add a 5th unit to the class. The Director of Naval Construction advised that the concept would be feasible only if the ships were powered solely by oil. Previous classes, including those still in construction, used fuel oil, which was still relatively scarce, as a supplement to coal, of which the UK then commanded huge reserves. However, the then First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill, undertook to guarantee a supply of oil in wartime, thereby allowing the program to proceed. The oil eventually was guaranteed by the negotiation of the Anglo-Persian Oil Convention. Meanwhile, an investigation led by Admiral Jackie Fisher had worked through all the logistical problems associated with using oil fuel instead of coal, and so oil fueling was selected for the Queen Elizabeth class. Relative to coal, oil has a much greater energy density. Vastly simplified refueling arrangements requires no stokers, and emits much less smoke to obscure gun laying, and makes the ships less visible on the horizon. A further ship was authorized in 1914 and would have been named Agincourt, although most sources and several official papers in the class's ship's cover describe her as a further repeat of the Queen Elizabeth design. One historian has suggested that Agincourt would have been built on battlecruiser lines. This design would have kept the Queen Elizabeth armament, but substituted thinner armor in order to gain a 28-knot top speed. Whatever the case, Agincourt was cancelled at the outbreak of war in 1914. In some respects, the ships did not quite fulfill their extremely demanding requirement. They were seriously overweight weight, as a result of which the draft was excessive and they were unable to reach the planned top speed of 25 knots. In the event, the combination of oil fuel and more boilers provided for a service speed of about 23 knots. Still a useful improvement on the traditional battle line speed of 21 knots and just fast enough to be thought of as the first fast battleships. However, after Jutland Admiral John Jellicoe was persuaded that the slowest ship of this class was good only for about 23 knots, he concluded that, since this should be considered as the speed of the squadron, it would not be safe to risk them in operations away from the main battle fleet. Despite these problems, most of which were mitigated in service, the ships were well received and proved outstandingly successful in combat. The savings in weight, cost and manpower made possible by oil fuel only were convincingly demonstrated, as were the benefits of concentrating a heavier armament into fewer mountings. The class was followed by the Revenge class, which took the Queen Elizabeth configuration and economized it back down to the standard 21-knot battle line. The intended successor to the Queen Elizabeth's was to be an unnamed fast battleship with high freeboard, with secondary armament mountings clear of spray, a shallow draft and a top speed of at least 30 knots. However, First Sea Lord Fisher changed it to an even faster but less armored battlecruiser. Out of the class of 4 ships, only HMS Hood was completed, though armor was hastily added during construction that would have made her theoretically on a par with the Queen Elizabeth's. The Royal Navy were well aware of the flawed reworking and always considered Hood a battlecruiser and not a fast battleship. Armor protection was modified from the previous Iron Duke class, with a thicker belt and improved underwater protection. The scale of deck armor was less generous, though typical of contemporary practice. However, 4 of the ships survived a considerable pounding at the Battle of Jutland while serving as the 5th Battle Squadron, so it should be judged as sufficient for its time. Main armament: the 15-inch gun turned out to be a complete success in service. It was reliable and extremely accurate, being able to drop tight groups of shells at 20,000 yards. Poor shell design reduced its effectiveness at the Battle of Jutland, but this was addressed with the arrival of the superior Green Boy shells in 1918. The gun even remained competitive in World War II after receiving further shell upgrades and mountings with greater elevation, and HMS Warspite would eventually record a hit during the Battle of Calabria, which to this day is one of the longest-range naval gunnery hits in history. The guns could elevate to 20 degrees and to depress to -5 degrees, but the turret sights could only elevate 15 degrees. Effectively limiting the range that could be achieved unless firing under director control. The sights were equipped to permit the guns to fire at full charge or with 3/4 charge. Secondary armament was designed and implemented on Queen Elizabeth. The 6-inch Mk-12 guns were mounted in hull casemates, with 6 guns under director control on each side in casemates on the upper deck between B turret and the second funnel, and 2 more in hull casemates on each side on the main deck aft below X and Y turrets, for a total of 16 guns. The mounting of the 6-inch secondary armament in hull casemates drastically reduced the reserve of buoyancy, since the casemates could take on water if submerged. In practice, the casemates would be flooded even in normal steaming if the sea was heavy. In addition, the ammunition supply arrangements for the 6-inch guns were relatively exposed during the Battle of Jutland. This resulted in an ammunition fire aboard Malaya that nearly resulted in the loss of the ship. The aft 4 casemate guns in Queen Elizabeth were soon found to be of little use and were removed and the casemates platted over, and the other ships were completed without them. The aft casemates were replaced in all ships with 2 guns protected by shields mounted on the forecastle deck, 1 on each side. The 10 guns, which were hence no longer required for the Queen Elizabeths, were used in 1915 to arm the 5 M29 class monitors. The forecastle-mounted guns were removed in late 1916, leaving the final configuration as 12 6-inch guns in hull casemates until the 1930s. The secondary armament of the 5 ships received differing degrees of modernization in the 1930s and is hence discussed on the individual ships' pages. Operational history. World War I. In World War I, Queen Elizabeth was detached from the squadron and took part in the Dardanelles campaign, but missed Jutland as she was undergoing dock maintenance. At the Battle of Jutland, 4 of the ships formed Admiral Hugh Evan Thomas's 5th Battle Squadron, and in the clash with the German 1st Scouting Group under Admiral Franz von Hipper they fired with extraordinary rapidity and accuracy, damaging SMS Lutzow and SMS Seydlitz and a number of other German warships. These battleships were able to engage German battlecruisers at a range of 19,000 yards, which was beyond the maximum range of the Germans' guns. 3 of the Queen Elizabeths received hits from German warships during the engagement, yet they all returned home. Warspite was the most heavily damaged, with her rudder jammed and taking 15 hits, coming close to foundering. Between the wars, the ships received considerable upgrades, including new machinery, small tube boilers, deck armor upgrades, torpedo belt armor, trunked funnels, new secondary armament and anti-aircraft armament, and many improvements in gun laying and electronics. Queen Elizabeth, Valiant, and Warspite were the most modernized, with all 3 receiving the new Queen Anne's Mansion block superstructure for the bridge, whilst 24.5 dual-purpose guns in 10 turret mountings replaced the 6 inches casemate secondary weapons on Queen Elizabeth and Valiant. Warspite kept her 6 inches secondary guns, now reduced to just 4 per battery. World War II. By World War II, the class were showing their age, and a battleship was becoming increasingly obsolescent in the face of air power. Barmen Malaya, the least modernized of the class, were at a disadvantage compared to modern battleships. In spite of this, Malaya prevented an attack on a transatlantic convoy by the modern German battlecruisers Scharnhorst and Gneisenau by her presence. Queen Elizabeth, Warspite, and Valiant, the more modernized of the class, fared better, with her modern fire control equipment. Warspite scored a hit on an Italian battleship during the Battle of Calabria at a range of more than 26,000 yards, one of the longest-range naval artillery hits in history. Modern torpedoes outclassed the torpedo belt protection. In November 1941, Barham, the least modernized of the quintet, was torpedoed by a U-boat and sank in 5 minutes, with the loss of over 800 of her crew, when her magazines detonated. Warspite survived a direct hit and 2 near misses by a German glider bomb, while Queen Elizabeth and Valiant were repaired and returned to service after being badly damaged by limpet mines placed by Italian frogmen during a raid at Alexandria Harbor in 1941. Ships. HMS Queen Elizabeth. Queen Elizabeth took part in the Dardanelles campaign of 1915, bombarding forts, but missed Jutland in 1916. She became Admiral Beatty's flagship in 1917 after he assumed command of the Grand Fleet. In World War II she was mined by Italian frogmen and badly damaged, but did not ground in the shallow water of Alexandria Harbor in 1941. She was subsequently repaired, and served in the Far East until 1945. HMS Warspite suffered severe damage at Jutland, being hit by at least 15 heavy shells. She lost 14 dead and 32 wounded, firing a total of 259 shells. In World War II, she took part in many battles, including Narvik, Cape Matapan, Crete, and Salerno, where she was hit by a glider bomb. She was never fully repaired, and became a coastal bombardment ship covering the Normandy landings, further operations in other parts of France, and the Walcheren landings. HMS Valiant. The Valiant received no hits at Jutland but suffered 1 wounded and fired 288 shells. In World War II, she took part in the destruction of the French fleet at Mers el-Kabir, and was mined and damaged at Alexandria in 1941. She was repaired, and served in the Far East until 1944. On 8 August 1944, whilst in the floating dock at Trincomalee, Ceylon, she was severely damaged when the dock collapsed, with the result that repairs were stopped. HMS Barham. Barham was named after Lord Barham, First Lord of the Admiralty. The Barham received 5 hits at Jutland, suffering 26 dead and 46 wounded, and fired 337 shells. In World War II, she fought at Cape Matapan. On 25 November 1941, she was struck by 3 torpedoes from U-331, commanded by Oberleutnant Zersee Hans Diedrich von Teisenhausen, and went down with 850 of her crew. The film sequence of her turning over onto to her port side and subsequent explosion is one of the most powerful non-nuclear explosions caught on film. HMS Malaya was hit 8 times at Jutland, suffering 63 dead and 68 wounded, and fired 215 shells. In World War II, she escorted convoys and was damaged by a torpedo from U-106 in 1941. Subsequently, she escorted several convoys and supported various operations following the Normandy invasion until she was decommissioned in 1945. HMS Agincourt. HMS Agincourt was to be the 6th member of the Queen Elizabeth class. She was authorized in 1913, and intended for completion in late 1916, but was cancelled after the outbreak of the First World War. She is not to be confused with the HMS Agincourt that was ordered by Brazil, sold to the Ottoman Empire while under construction, and seized for use by the Royal Navy before the beginning of the First World War. Other ships. The Canadian Naval Aid Bill of 1913 intended to provide the funds for 3 modern battleships, which most likely would have been 3 more members of the Queen Elizabeth class, potentially named as Acadia, Quebec and Ontario, in much the same way as Malaya had been funded. The bill met with stiff opposition in Parliament, and was not passed. It is unclear if these ships would have served in the Royal Navy, or if they would have served in the Royal Canadian Navy. Bibliography. Bray, Siegfried. Battleships and Battlecruisers 1905–1970. New York. Doubleday. ISBN 0-385-07247-3. Brown, D.K. The Grand Fleet Warship Design and Development 1906–1922. Caxton Editions. ISBN 1-8406-7-531-4. Brown, David. The Royal Navy and the Mediterranean, November 1940 – December 1941, Volume 2. Frank Cass Publishers. ISBN 0-7146-52059. Burt, Ra. British Battleships 1919–1945. Seaforth Publishing. ISBN 9781848321304. Churchill, Winston S. The World Crisis, 1911–1918. Free Press. ISBN 0743283430. Gregor, René. Battleships of the World. Annapolis, Maryland, Naval Institute Press. ISBN 1-55750-069-X. Leo, Marriott. Vital Guide Fighting Ships of World War II. Ramsbury, England. Airlife Crowwood Press. ISBN 184037-4160. Leo, Marriott. Vital Guide Fighting Ships of World War II. Ramsbury, England. Airlife Crowwood Press. ISBN 184037-4160. Raven, Alan. Roberts, John. British Battleships of World War II. Annapolis, Maryland, Naval Institute Press. ISBN 0870218174. Miller, David. The Illustrated Directory of Warships from 1860 to the Present Day. Greenwich Editions, 3rd ed. Salamander Books Limited, London, England. ISBN 0862886775.